Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 3 of Abnormal Psychology, Causal Factors and Viewpoints. Causes and risk factors for abnormal behavior. When we study the causes and risk factors for abnormal behavior, there's three different things that we look at. First, the necessary, sufficient, and contributory causes. Second, feedback and bidirectionality in abnormal behavior. And third, the Diathesis-Stress Model. When we look at necessary, sufficient, and contributory causes, these terms mean pretty much exactly what they mean, what you would think the term was. Let's look at the next slide for a further explanation. When we talk about a necessary cause, if disorder Y occurs, then cause X must have preceded it. So therefore, cause X is necessary for disorder Y to occur. With sufficient cause, if cause X occurs, then disorder Y will also occur. So in this case, cause X is sufficient. It's not necessary, but it's enough to cause disorder Y. And then in contributory, think about contributes. If X occurs, then the probability of disorder Y increases because X contributes to the chances of disorder Y increasing. So read this in your text and make sure that you have it straight in your head and you're able to recognize it on an exam. Next we have the Diathesis-Stress Model. Diathesis refers to a necessary or a contributory cause that is not sufficient in and of itself to cause a disorder. So a person may have a predisposition to develop a disorder. And then we look to the other side and we see stress, and stress is the response of an individual to taxing demands. So when the diathesis, the predisposition, is combined with the stress, then we have the Diathesis-Stress Model and a combination that is sufficient to cause the disorder. So when we study these, and we'll look at different ways they study this in a few minutes, but you may have two people with the same diathesis, but one is put under the stress and therefore the disorder develops, and another one grows up in a different environment and that is not ever triggered. Two terms also related to this are resilience and protective factors. Resilience is the ability to successfully adapt to very difficult circumstances. Think of a very resilient person. They bounce back, kind of like a rubber band or a rubber ball that would bounce back. Then we also have protective factors, and these are influences that may modify a person's response. It could be their personality or temperament. It could be a supportive adult in their life. It could be a special talent that they have, but it serves to protect them from some of the things that would normally cause a stress to be triggered. Biological viewpoint and causal factors. When we study abnormal behavior, there's the traditional biological viewpoint that looks at the person and comes up with a theory for why they are struggling with a mental illness. But the current viewpoint seeks to take a bigger view. We not only look at the biological or the biology of the person, but we take into account all aspects, including the environment in which they are growing up in. When we look at the biological viewpoint, there's four categories that are believed to be relevant to maladaptive behavior: the neurotransmitter and hormonal abnormalities in the brain, genetic vulnerabilities, temperament, and brain dysfunction and neuroplasticity. When we talk about neurotransmitters in the brain, they play a large role in abnormal behavior. Many of these can be kept under control with the use of pharmaceutical drugs. Some forms of psychopathology have also been linked to abnormal or hormonal abnormalities. This would take a doctor or psychiatrist to do the testing to determine if this is the case. The relationship of genotypes to phenotypes. Genotype refers to our total genetic endowment. That's what we come into this world with, the personality, the temperament, and all the different traits that we have genetically. And phenotype is the observed structural and functional characteristics. And what they have found to be very interesting is that the genotype can sometimes influence the phenotype. So if a person has a temperament that is a little more introverted, or they're suspicious and don't really trust people, then the way that they come across to people may actually cause people to treat them the way they expect them to, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so sometimes they study twins that were separated and raised in different environments, or people that have similar genotypes, but then because of other things in their life, their phenotype ends up being different. So what I'm referring to is what we call genotype environment correlations, and this refers to the way that an individual's genotype may shape the environment, and it can be shaped through a passive effect, an evocative effect, or an active effect. And you can read more about this in your textbook. It's really very interesting, but make sure that you kind of have it straight in your head and again are able to recognize it on an exam. How do we study these genetic influences? Traditional methods would be taking a family history, studying twins, and studying someone who had been adopted out of the family. More recent methods include linkage analysis and association studies. Temperament. Temperament is the child's reactivity and the characteristic ways of self regulation. How do they self regulate? How do they self soothe? And early temperament is the basis from which personality develops. Next, we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud. Freud theorized that a person's behavior results from the interaction of the id, the ego, and the superego, and that basically the ego was dealing with neurotic or moral anxiety and trying to keep things in balance between the id, the ego, and the superego. And when the anxiety level would rise, would resort to ego defense mechanisms. Now, I asked you in your form question to talk about some ego defense mechanisms, and then I also want you to be able to identify them on the exam. If I give you a scenario of a person and how they're acting, I want you to be able to recognize their actions as an ego defense mechanism, either sublimation, repression, regression, reaction formation, rationalization, projection, fixation, or displacement. Freud also came up with 5 psychosexual stages of development, and his belief was that for a person to be healthy, they needed to successfully move through each stage. And if they became stuck in a stage, the thought was that this would come out later in their life in the form of some maladaptive behaviors. The 5 stages of psychosexual development are the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency period, and the genital stage. Next, we're going to talk about classical conditioning. I mentioned this a little bit in Module 2 when we talked about Pavlov's dog, but what I want you to be familiar with and able to identify is, in a scenario, what is the conditioned stimulus, what is the unconditional stimulus, what is the unconditional response, and what is the conditioned response. There are several examples in your book. You can find some more online, but just understanding how to label a scenario if given one on your exam. Now, one thing that's interesting about classical conditioning, let's just take Pavlov's dog. In that scenario, he would ring the bell, give the dog food, and the dog would salivate. After this was done repeatedly, he found that he could ring the bell, not present food, and the dog would still salivate in anticipation of the food. However, if the conditioned stimulus was repeatedly presented without the food, then extinction of the behavior would occur. So eventually, if he rang the bell and did not give the food, eventually when he would ring the bell, the dog would not salivate anymore. Generalization and discrimination. This again is talking about conditioned stimuluses and responses. In generalization, the response is conditioned to one stimulus, but we could evoke that response by presenting another similar stimuli. However, in discrimination, the object is able to learn to distinguish between similar stimuli. So they discriminate and do not um, respond to a similar stimuli as they do to the one that they were conditioned with. Another way of learning and influencing behavior is through observational learning. And this is a real simple definition. It's learning through observation alone without directly experiencing an unconditioned stimulus. My husband says this happened to him. He had an older brother and he saw what his brother did and how he was disciplined or what he got in trouble for. And he said, I'm not stupid. I learned from that. I'm not going to do that behavior. So it's very similar to that, where a person or animal learns through observing what happens to another person or animal when they perform a certain behavior. The cognitive behavioral perspective. When we talk about cognitive behavior, I want you to think cognitive, the brain, thinking, and behavioral, how you react based on your thinking. And so, cognitive behavioral perspective will focus on how thoughts and information processing become distorted. How do people develop this wrong thinking? The self-talk that becomes distorted, and then this leads to maladaptive emotions and behavior. Another thing that affects learning is parenting styles. We've identified four main categories of parenting styles: the authoritative, the authoritarian, permissive, indulgent, or neglectful and uninvolved. The authoritative is found to be the most successful type of parenting. In this parenting, parents are high on warmth and moderate on control. They're careful to set clear limits and restrictions regarding certain kinds of behavior. And research shows that the children of this type of parent grow up to be friendly and to show development of general competencies for dealing with others and with their environments. The authoritarian parent is low on warmth and high on control and often cold and demanding. Research shows that these children or children of these parents tend to be conflicted, irritable, and moody. When they're followed into adolescence, these children have more negative outcomes, and the boys do particularly poorly in social and cognitive skills. The third parenting style is the permissive indulgent parent. They are high on warmth and low on control and discipline. And research shows that these children tend to be impulsive and aggressive. Overly indulged children are characteristically spoiled, selfish, impatient, inconsiderate, and demanding. Neglectful and uninvolved is the fourth parenting style. These parents are low on warmth and low on control. Children raised by this type of parenting style tend to be moody and to have low self-esteem and conduct problems later in childhood. They also have problems with peer relations and with academic performance. Now, when we look at all these different theories and ideas about the causal factors of abnormal behavior, what we need to realize is that none of the current theories address the whole spectrum of abnormality. There's gaps in each of these theories. To resolve that, some people have taken an eclectic approach where they pull a little bit from here and a little bit from there. That may work for people, but it's not successful at a theoretical level. And so, our textbook and throughout this course, we're going to be taking a biopsychosocial perspective, and that is believed to be the only current attempt at a unified approach. And if you look at that word, we're going to look at the biological contributions, the psychological contributions, and the social contributions to a person's behavior and how they work together to cause the abnormal behavior.